We're dying out here. Command, this is Ironhorse 6. We are dying. Then static. Then nothing at all. 31 soldiers pinned on a ridge that officially did not exist. A colonel bleeding into rock, begging for help nobody upstairs would authorize. And 300 miles away, a woman who hadn't flown in 18 months picked up a phone that rang 3 times, paused, and rang 3 more. Her name was Dakota Shaw, 27 years old, grounded, forgotten, the daughter of a pilot the Air Force swore died in an accident 12 years ago. Except her father's wreckage was sitting in that exact valley, right where the official report said it could never be found. She was ordered to stand down. She was told she'd be arrested the moment she landed. She climbed into the cockpit anyway, because some silences aren't graves. Some of them are just waiting for someone brave enough to dig. The radio crackled at 0400 hours, and Colonel Marcus Voss's voice broke apart into static and terror. We're dying out here. Command, this is Ironhorse 6. We are dying. Repeat. We are dying. Then nothing. Just the hiss of dead air. Just the sound of a man who had commanded soldiers for 30 years, reduced to a whisper of desperation nobody back home would ever hear. Because that transmission never reached command. Not officially. It reached a retired pilot standing barefoot on a dock 300 miles from anywhere that mattered, holding a fishing rod she hadn't cast in 20 minutes. Her name was Dakota Shaw, and she was about to remember exactly who she used to be. The lake sat still that morning, fog low on the water, cold enough that her breath came out in threads, disappearing before they finished forming. She stood at the end of the dock in an old flight jacket, rolled sleeves that still smelled faintly of jet fuel, no matter how many times she washed them. Some smells don't wash out. They live in the fabric. They live in you. She wasn't fishing, not really. The rod was a prop, a reason to stand still without looking like she was standing still for no reason. Behind her, the cabin, small, wood siding gone silver with weather. A woodpile stacked with military precision, each log squared off at the same angle because old habits don't retire even when you do. Inside, a locked case under the floorboards. Nobody knew about that case. Not the neighbors, not the mailman. Nobody. Dakota Shaw was 27 years old, and she had already lived 3 lives. The daughter, the pilot, and now this, whatever this was, the woman who used to fly an A-10 Thunderbolt, and now spent her mornings watching geese cross a gray sky, wondering if her hands still remembered how to do the one thing they'd been built to do. She flexed her fingers. Muscle memory doesn't ask permission. It just answers when called. Some mornings were easier than others. Some mornings she woke up and the lake was just a lake, and the fog was just weather, and she could make coffee and read a paperback on the porch like a woman who had never once heard a .50 caliber round pass close enough to feel the air split around it. Those mornings had gotten more frequent over the last 18 months, rare and precious in the way anything gets precious once you've learned it isn't guaranteed. This wasn't one of those mornings, because last night she dreamed the dream again. The one where she was 15, standing on a tarmac that didn't exist in any airfield she'd ever actually visited, watching an aircraft climb into a sky that kept getting darker no matter how far it flew. In the dream, she always tried to shout a warning. In the dream, her voice never worked. She woke at 0347 with her heart slamming and her hands already reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Because some nights her body forgot even 18 months into a discharge that had never been officially finalized that she wasn't supposed to need a weapon within reach to fall back asleep. She'd given up on sleep after that. Made coffee she didn't drink. Walked down to the dock instead because the water at least had the decency to stay quiet when she needed it to, and because standing still in cold air had always been easier than lying still in a warm bed with a mind that wouldn't stop moving. And somewhere underneath the quiet, a phone was ringing. She heard it through the cabin screen door. 3 rings. A pause. 3 more. That wasn't a coincidence. That was a code, an old code, one only 2 people alive still remembered. Her hand went still on the rod, because that ring pattern belonged to exactly one person. 12 years ago, in a valley she could still find on a map, with her eyes closed, her father had died. Colonel James Shaw, fighter pilot. Legend if you ask the men who flew with him. Ghost if you ask the ones who buried him. The official report said mechanical failure. Said his aircraft went down in bad weather 40 miles from the nearest evac point, and that no one could have reached him in time. Dakota had read that report so many times, the paper had gone soft at the folds. She knew every sentence, every carefully bloodless word. Because the official report was a lie. She didn't have proof, not yet. Just an ache in her chest that had never once, not for a single day in 12 years, agreed with the paperwork. She remembered being 15 and standing at a funeral with a flag folded into a triangle in her hands, heavier than anything should be, that could fit between two palms. She remembered a general she wouldn't forget his face if she lived to be 90, standing 3 rows back, not making eye contact, watching his shoes, watching anything except her. She'd asked her mother once, years later, asked why nobody talked about what really happened out there. Her mother had only said some silences are graves too, Dakota. Don't go digging. But there was one thing her mother never knew. One thing Dakota had never told anyone, not even Eli. Not even in the long nights after training exercises when the two of them sat on a runway apron trading stories to keep from thinking about the ones they'd lost. The night before her father's final flight, he had called her, 15 years old, half asleep, phone pressed against her ear in the dark. Something's not right about this one, Dot. Dot. Nobody else ever called her that. If anything happens, you go find Voss. He's the only one up that chain who won't lie to your face. Nothing's going to happen, she'd told him. 15 and certain of it, the way only 15-year-olds can be certain of things they have no power over. No, he'd said. Probably not. But his voice had that hollow sound. The sound of a man already saying goodbye and hoping nobody would notice. 2 days later, a folded flag. A general who wouldn't look at her. And a promise she had never once acted on, because there had never been a reason to. Because Voss had gone quiet after the funeral transferred out within the month, and by the time Dakota was old enough to go looking for answers, there was nothing left to find. Just a report, just paper, just silence dressed up as an explanation. She'd tried not to dig. She'd built a whole career out of not digging. Flew the same aircraft her father flew. Earned a call sign Reaper because of a strafing run so precise it left men on both sides of the radio speechless. Made captain by 25. Made enemies by 26. Because that's what happens when you ask too many questions about a redacted mission file with your father's name buried in the footnotes. 18 months ago, they grounded her. Said her judgment was compromised. Said an inquiry needed to happen quietly out of the spotlight, and that until it concluded, she would not be cleared to fly. The inquiry never concluded. It just went silent. Like everything else that mattered. So she came here. To the lake. To the fog. To the version of herself that didn't need clearance to exist. Until the phone rang 3 times, paused, and rang 3 more. She crossed the yard, barefoot, cold ground biting up through her heels, and picked up on the 4th ring of the 2nd set. "Shaw," she said. Silence first. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 18 months, and it did something to her chest she wasn't prepared for. "Dakota." Marcus Voss, older sounding, rougher, like gravel dragged over gravel. "It's Voss." "I know who it is." She closed her eyes. "Nobody else calls this number. I need you to listen, and I need you not to hang up before I finish." "That's never a good opening line, sir." "No," Voss said. "It isn't." She heard him breathe, heard the kind of pause that precedes something a man doesn't want to say out loud, not even to someone he trusts. "Ironhorse is pinned down," he said. 11 hours ago, we lost contact with 2 forward teams. 6 hours ago, the 3rd team went dark mid-transmission. I've got 31 soldiers on a ridge with no extraction, no air cover, and command sitting on their hands because the politics upstairs don't want this operation to exist on paper. Dakota's hand tightened on the phone. "Why are you calling me?" she said. "I'm grounded because you're the only pilot I trust who still remembers how to fly that terrain blind. And because..." He stopped. "Because what?" "Because I think this connects to your father. The fog outside seemed to get louder somehow. Or maybe it was just her pulse. "Say that again," she said quietly. "The valley we're pinned in. Same coordinates, Dakota. Same ridge. I didn't put it together until an hour ago, and when I did, my hands started shaking so bad I could barely hold the map." She didn't answer. Couldn't. Because 12 years of careful, disciplined, not thinking about it, collapsed in under 4 seconds. "I need air support," Voss said. "I need it now, and I need someone who won't blink when they see what's waiting up there. Command won't authorize it. I already asked. They said the operation doesn't exist. Which means the men dying in it don't exist either." "Then how am I supposed to fly a mission that doesn't exist?" Dakota said. "You're not," Voss said. "Not officially. I'm asking you as a man who watched your father die and never said a word about it because I was ordered not to. I'm asking you because I owe him a debt I never paid. And because right now, 31 men are about to become the same kind of silence he became." She closed her eyes. Phone pressed hard against her ear. The fog outside pressing against the cabin windows like something patient and unhurried, entirely indifferent to the fact that somewhere far away, a man she hadn't heard from in 18 months, had just handed her the exact shape of the thing she'd spent 12 years trying not to want. The line went quiet again. Just static breathing, the low creak of the dock behind her, rocking in wind she hadn't noticed picking up. "Tell me what you have," she said finally. "Numbers, position, everything." She heard paper rustle on his end, heard him steady his voice the way commanders do when they're about to recite a casualty count like it's a grocery list, because if you let it sound like anything else, you'll never get through it. 31 effectives on the ridge dug into whatever cover they could find. 2 confirmed wounded, 1 critical. We're taking fire from at least 2 elevated positions, maybe 3 in every hour. We don't move, they walk their range and a little closer. I've got a combat controller with a radio and a prayer, and that's it. That's the whole cavalry. And Command's answer is nothing. Command's answer is that this operation isn't happening, which means if those men die up there, they die off the books. No casualty notification, no folded flag, no name on a wall anywhere, because as far as anyone will ever be told, they were never there to begin with. "Sound you." Dakota's throat tightened. She knew exactly what that kind of erasure looked like from the other side of it. She'd spent 12 years living inside the wreckage of one. "Why would Command bury an active operation?" she said slowly. "Even a black one. Even off the manifest. You don't leave men to die just to protect paperwork." "I don't know," Voss said, and for the first time in the conversation, his voice cracked open just slightly, just enough to let something raw show through. "But I know this valley, Dakota. I know it the way you know a scar. And I have spent 12 years telling myself I didn't recognize these coordinates the first time I saw them on a map. Because if I let myself recognize them, I'd have to ask the question I've been avoiding since the day we buried your father." "Ask it," she said. "What if it was never an accident?" The fog outside pressed against the windows like something listening. "Give me 6 hours," Dakota said. "You don't have 6 hours? Then give me 4. She didn't remember hanging up the phone. She remembered standing in the cabin doorway staring at the floorboards at the exact plank that hid the case underneath it. Because some decisions don't feel like decisions. They feel like falling. Like the moment before your body hits water, when it's already too late to change your mind, when gravity has already made the choice for you. She pried up the floorboard. Inside a flight suit folded with the same precision as the woodpile outside. Dog tags hers, and her father's tangled together from years of being carried in the same pocket. A photograph, edges soft from handling of a young girl on an airfield tarmac, grinning up at a man in a flight helmet, who was grinning right back. She held the photograph for a moment longer than she meant to. Remembered the smell of that tarmac jet fuel and hot asphalt, and her father's aftershave, the particular ordinary Tuesday it had been, before either of them knew it would end up folded into a memory she'd carry the rest of her life. He'd let her sit in the cockpit that day, hands too small for the controls, and told her that someday those hands would grow into exactly the size they needed to be. She hadn't believed him then. She believed him now, whether she wanted to or not. And underneath all of it, a single sheet of paper, yellowed, folded into quarters. The inquiry file she wasn't supposed to have copied. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she put it in her jacket pocket next to the dog tags and got dressed. On the ridge 1,200 miles from anything that looked like help, Colonel Marcus Voss pressed his back against a slab of broken rock and counted his breaths, because counting breaths was the only thing left that felt like control. Around him, what remained of Ironhorse Six. 29 men now, not 31, because 2 names had already gone quiet in the last hour and nobody had said their names out loud yet. Because saying them out loud made it real, and real was a luxury nobody up here could afford. A young private Danny something. Voss's memory kept slipping on the last name, which frightened him more than the gunfire did, pressed a field dressing against his own forearm with shaking hands and looked up at him with the particular kind of question every soldier eventually asks a commander. They still against all evidence believe in. "Sir, is help coming?" Voss looked at his radio. At the frequency he'd used to make a call he wasn't supposed to make to a woman he wasn't supposed to contact, asking for help that officially could not exist. "Yeah," he said, because it was the only answer he had left to give. "Help's coming." He didn't know if it was true. He only knew that somewhere out past the fog, a woman with her father's stubborn jaw and her father's exact way of going quiet before she did something reckless was either already in the air or about to be. And that if she wasn't, then every one of these men was going to die in a valley that would never appear on any casualty report, and the last thing they'd hear would be a lie he'd told to keep them from panicking in their final hour. The gunfire picked up again along the eastern face. Voss pressed his back harder into the rock and started counting his breaths once more. And somewhere in the fog above the ridge, though he couldn't have known it yet, an aircraft with a call sign nobody had officially cleared was already pushing through gray morning air toward the sound of his voice. Eli Ferris answered his door in a bathrobe holding a mug of coffee that went crooked in his hand the second he saw who was standing on his porch. "No," he said immediately. "Whatever it is, no. I haven't said anything yet." "You don't need to say anything. I know that face. That's the face you made right before you talked me into free-falling out of a perfectly good aircraft over unfamiliar terrain at 0300. And I still have a knee that clicks because of that face. Your knee clicks because you're old, Eli. I'm 34. Old for this line of work." He let her in anyway, because Eli Ferris had spent 6 years as a joint terminal attack controller, calling in strikes so close to friendly lines that most men wouldn't sign off on them. And in all that time, there had only ever been one voice on the other end of the radio he trusted without question. Hers. His kitchen still had a training schedule taped to the refrigerator from 18 months ago. Neither of them had ever mentioned it. Neither of them had ever taken it down. "You know what today is?" Eli said, pouring a second mug she hadn't asked for and setting it in front of her anyway. 18 months to the day since they pulled your wings. I know because I marked it. I don't know why I marked it. Guess some part of me was waiting for exactly this. You're not surprised? I'm never surprised by you, Shaw. Just occasionally horrified. She told him everything. The phone call, the coordinates, her father. He set the coffee down without drinking it. "Say the name again," he said. "The colonel's name. Voss, Marcus Voss." Eli's jaw worked for a moment before he spoke. "I flew a rotation under him years back, before you and I ever crossed paths. Man doesn't waste words, and he sure as hell doesn't waste favors. If he's calling you breaking however many regulations it took to get your number, he's not doing it lightly. He said this connects to my father. I heard you the first time. I just needed to hear myself say it back before I let it be real. That valley's a meat grinder," he said. "I've read the terrain reports. 3 ridgelines, 1 road in, and it floods with fog by mid-afternoon so bad you can't see your own boots." "I know. And command's not authorizing this." "No. Which means if we go alone. No support package. No search and rescue standing by if it goes wrong. Just us, an aircraft that isn't cleared for the mission, and a pilot who isn't cleared to fly it." "Yes," Dakota said. Eli looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that measures a person, weighs them, decides something important without saying it out loud. "Casey's not going to like this," he said finally. "Casey doesn't have to like it. Casey's going to come anyway. You know that. I know that too." Casey Marlowe was 26 years old, 4 years out of flight school, top of her class in avionics systems, and had never once in her career flown a mission that wasn't logged, sanctioned, and reviewed by 3 levels of command before the wheels left the ground. She believed in the manual, the way some people believed in scripture, not because she lacked imagination, but because she had watched exactly one instructor die during her 2nd year of training after improvising outside the flight envelope, and had promised herself afterward that she would never again mistake confidence for competence. She said as much loudly standing in the hangar at 4 in the morning with her arms crossed and her jaw set like she was preparing for a fight she already knew she'd lose. "This is insane," she said. "You want to fly an unsanctioned combat sortie into hostile terrain with a grounded pilot and 0 air cover backup. Do you understand how many ways that ends badly?" "I've counted them," Dakota said. "Most of them end with me not caring, because there's a colonel out there whose last transmission was him telling command he's dying. That's not a strategy. That's a death wish with extra steps. Maybe." Casey stared at her. Something in Dakota's flatness, her refusal to flinch, seemed to unsettle her more than shouting would have. "You people," Casey said, shaking her head, "you still think the old way works. Fly in low, trust your gut, improvise under fire. That's how pilots die, Captain. That's how they died 20 years ago. And it's how they'll keep dying if nobody updates the doctrine." "The doctrine didn't save my father," Dakota said quietly. "Maybe the doctrine's not the thing keeping people alive out there. Maybe it's the people who break it when it needs breaking." That landed somewhere. Casey's arms uncrossed slow like she hadn't meant to let them. "You think I don't know what it looks like from where you're standing?" Dakota said. "Some washed-up captain chasing a ghost, dragging good pilots into a court-martial because she can't let go of a story that ended 12 years ago." "The thought crossed my mind," Casey admitted. "It should. You'd be right to think it." Dakota looked at her steady, unflinching. "But somewhere on that ridge there's a 22-year-old private who enlisted 8 months ago, who has a mother back home who doesn't even know what country he's in, and he is currently listening to his commanding officer tell him help isn't coming. I don't need you to believe in me, Marlowe. I need you to believe that matters more than a regulation." Casey was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Eli, watching from the wall, didn't dare say a word. "You're going regardless," Casey said finally. It wasn't a question. "Regardless. Then I'm coming. Because somebody with actual current qualifications needs to be in that hangar making sure this aircraft doesn't fall out of the sky because nobody signed the maintenance log in 18 months. Yes, that's not a yes. It's the closest thing to one you're getting." Eli, leaning against the wall with his arms folded, allowed himself the smallest smile, the kind he rarely let anyone see before a mission that had any real chance of going sideways. "Welcome to the team, kid." "I'm not on a team," Casey snapped. "I'm on a mistake with wings." But she was already reaching for a headset. The 3 of them worked through the aircraft in the gray hour before dawn, running checks by flashlight, because Dakota didn't want the hangar lights drawing attention from anyone still awake on base. Because that's what it had become, a theft in progress. Stealing back a version of herself the Air Force had taken away 18 months earlier. 1 bolt and 1 gauge at a time. Eli mapped the terrain on a laptop balanced on a toolbox, tracing the ridgeline with 1 finger. Ironhorse's last known position puts them here. He tapped the screen. Between these 2 rock formations. If Voss's team pushed east under fire, they'd be funneled into this draw, no cover exposed on both flanks. "That's where my father went down," Dakota said. Eli looked up at her. "You sure?" "I've had 12 years to memorize a map I was never supposed to have." He didn't ask how she got it. Some questions between people who trusted each other didn't need asking. "If that's the terrain," Casey said, arms deep in an open panel voice muffled. Then whoever's got Voss's people pinned down knows exactly what they're doing. That's not random. That's someone who understands the ground. Or someone who is told exactly where to wait, Dakota said, almost to herself. Silence settled over the hangar. The particular silence that follows a sentence nobody wants to be the first to agree with out loud. Because if someone had known where to wait 12 years ago, and again now, that meant the same hand might be moving both times. And that was a thought too large to hold on to while there were still pre-flight checks to run. Fuel, Dakota said instead, pushing it down, pushing it away. Talk to me about fuel. Full tanks, Casey said. Give you enough loiter time over target if you don't waste it getting there. Ordnance? Loaded, guns fed, everything green. Casey straightened, wiped her hands on her flight suit, looked at Dakota with something that had shifted since the hangar argument. Not quite respect yet, but close enough to see it from here. For a pilot who hasn't flown in a year and a half, you're asking the right questions. I never stopped flying, Dakota said. I just stopped having an aircraft under me. She ran her palm along the fuselage as she walked its length the way you'd rest a hand on the shoulder of an old friend you hadn't seen in too long. Metal cold under her fingers. The paint chipped in one spot near the nose, chipped the exact same way it had been 18 months ago. Because nobody had touched this particular aircraft since the day they grounded her, as if the whole squadron had silently agreed to leave it waiting. They kept her ready, Dakota said quietly. Somebody kept her ready. That was me, Eli said, not looking up from the laptop. Every month. Told maintenance it was for currency drills. Wasn't really lying. Just wasn't telling the whole truth either. Dakota didn't say anything. Didn't trust her voice to hold if she tried. Don't get sentimental on me now, Shaw, Eli said, glancing up just long enough to catch her expression. Save it for the parts where we're not about to commit several federal crimes before breakfast. Copy that, she said, and something in her chest loosened just slightly, just enough to breathe around. Casey climbed down from the wing checklist clipped to her forearm, eyes scanning the fuselage one final time with the thoroughness of someone who had learned the hard way. Probably that thoroughness was the only thing standing between a routine flight and a funeral. Hydraulics nominal, avionics nominal. I want to run one more pass on the weapons release system before your wheels up, because if that jams over hostile terrain, we're not exactly in a position to radio for a mechanic. How long? 15 minutes. Maybe 20. We don't have 20. Then you'd better hope I'm fast, Casey said, already moving. Eli watched her go, then looked back at Dakota, voice dropping low enough that only the two of them would hear it. She reminds me of somebody. Don't. I'm just saying, sharp mouth. Won't back down. Flies like she's got something to prove. He shrugged. Reminds me of somebody who used to argue with me in briefings until I gave in just to make the noise stop. I never made you give in. You made everybody give in, Shaw. You just did it so quietly nobody noticed they'd lost the argument until it was already over. Despite everything, the fog outside the phone call, the coordinates that matched a valley she'd spent 12 years trying not to think about, Dakota almost smiled. Almost. At 05:30, the call came in from base, the one Dakota had been dreading since the moment she picked up Voss's phone call. The one that would make this whole thing official in the worst possible way. A voice on the hangar radio clipped cold, unmistakably, a man used to being obeyed without question. Captain Shaw, this is General Ashford. I'm told you're preparing an aircraft for unauthorized deployment. Eli glanced up sharply at the sound of the name, something crossing his face too fast for Dakota to read before he bent back over the relay panel, adjusting a dial with more attention than the signal strength seemed to warrant. That's a strange connection for a 3-star working a stateside desk, he murmured, mostly to himself, mostly not meant for Dakota to hear. Routing looks military-grade forward relay, not administrative line. Man's either got expensive taste in phones, or he isn't where the letterhead says he is. Dakota filed the observation away, without understanding yet why it mattered, and picked up the handset slowly. Because some conversations you can feel coming before they arrive, the way you feel. Weather change in your joints. General, you are grounded, Captain. Have been for 18 months. You do not have clearance to fly, and this office has not authorized any sortie into the coordinates Colonel Voss has apparently been feeding you. Colonel Voss has 31 soldiers dying on a ridge, sir. Colonel Voss's operation does not exist. Not on any manifest I've signed. Which means, as far as this command is concerned, there is nothing happening in that valley that requires a response. Something in Dakota went very still, very cold. With respect, sir, men don't stop dying just because you didn't sign the paperwork. A pause on the line. Long enough that she could hear him breathing. Long enough that some old instinct in her, the same instinct her father must have felt standing in some briefing room 12 years ago, told her exactly what was coming next. She thought about the timbre of his voice, how familiar it sounded, even after all these years. And something cold moved through her chest as she realized why. She had heard this voice before. Not on a radio, in person. Standing 3 rows back at a funeral, watching his shoes instead of a 15-year-old girl holding a folded flag. General, she said slowly, were you at Firebase Cedar 12 years ago? The extraction that never came. The silence that followed was longer than any pause a busy general should have time for. I don't see the relevance of that question, Captain. That's not a no, sir. Stand down, Ashford said again, and this time his voice had lost whatever thin patience it started with. This is not a discussion. This is an order. And if you disobey it, I promise you whatever future you think you're throwing away today will look like a gift compared to what happens next. You will stand down, Captain Shaw, Ashford said. That is a direct order. If you attempt to take that aircraft off this base, you will be arrested the moment you land, and every charge this Air Force has ever considered against you will be filed by end of week. Do you understand me? Dakota looked at Eli, at Casey, at the aircraft behind them, engines cold waiting. She thought about her father's dog tags in her jacket pocket, about a folded flag heavier than it had any right to be, about a general who wouldn't meet a 15-year-old's eyes at a funeral. I understand you, sir, she said, and then she set the handset down without waiting for a reply. For a moment, nobody in the hangar moved. The radio hummed with dead air. Somewhere outside, a truck engine turned over far away, and Dakota found herself wondering distantly whether that was the arrest team already mobilizing, or just the base waking up to an ordinary Tuesday that had no idea what was about to happen inside this hangar. She thought about her father's voice on the phone that last night. Something's not right about this one. She thought about how certain he'd sounded and how wrong he'd turned out to be about the probably not that followed it. She thought about 31 names that didn't officially exist, dying in a valley that didn't officially exist because a general with something to hide had decided paperwork mattered more than people. And she thought with a clarity that frightened her a little that she was not going to let that happen twice in one lifetime. That's it then, Casey said, watching her. That's a direct order from a general. You just... I heard him, Dakota said. So what are we doing? Dakota turned to look at both of them. Eli already halfway resigned to whatever came next the way he always was. Casey, jaw tight, eyes sharp, still deciding, really deciding, whether this was a mistake she was willing to make with her eyes open. You're not doing anything, Dakota said. You're going home, both of you. This is mine. Like hell it is, Eli said. He'll bury you both if you're standing next to me when this comes apart. Then we'll be buried standing next to somebody worth it, Eli said, and it came out rougher than he meant it to, like it surprised him too. Casey didn't say anything at all. She just walked past. Dakota climbed the ladder to the cockpit and started running the final startup checklist like the conversation had already been settled somewhere Dakota hadn't been invited to. Because sometimes people don't answer you with words. Sometimes they answer you by simply refusing to leave. Dakota stood at the base of the aircraft for one long moment. The gray of the sky starting to lighten at the edges. the dog tags cold against her chest under the flight suit where they'd sat every single day. She'd worn a uniform since she was old enough to enlist. She thought about Voss's voice cracking on the radio. "We're dying." She thought about her father's file folded into quarters in her pocket. 12 years of unanswered questions pressing against her ribs. And she thought clearly finally, without any of the fog that had followed her for a year and a half, that there were only two kinds of people in this world. The ones who let silence win, and the ones who didn't. She climbed the ladder. "Reaper's up," she said into the headset, using the call sign for the first time in 18 months, and it fit her voice the way it always had, like something that had never actually stopped belonging to her. Casey looked over from the front seat, something unreadable crossing her face. "For the record," Casey said, "I still think this is insane." "Noted. I'm coming anyway." "I know. Not because of you," Casey added quickly, like she needed to say it before she lost the nerve. "Because of the kid on that ridge. The one you mentioned. The one who doesn't know help isn't supposed to be coming." "I know that too," Dakota said, and she meant it. Because somewhere between the hangar argument and this moment, something had shifted between them, quiet and unannounced, the way trust sometimes builds itself when nobody's looking directly at it. Behind them, Eli's voice crackled through the headset from the ground station, already patched into the terrain map, already running numbers on wind and fuel and the coordinates of 31 men who didn't know yet that someone was coming for them. "Ironhorse 6, this is Ghost Actual," he said, voice steady despite everything. "If you can hear this on any frequency, hold on. Somebody's coming." The engines caught. The sound rolled through the hangar like something waking up after a very long sleep. And Dakota Shaw taxied toward the runway of a base she was about to be arrested on, flying an aircraft. She wasn't authorized to fly toward a valley that had already taken her father once and might very well be waiting to take her too. Because that's the thing about ghosts, she thought, throttle climbing wheels lifting off the tarmac into gray morning air. Sooner or later they come back to finish what started them. The base fell away beneath her in gray streaks. Hangars. Runway lights still burning against the dawn. A single truck racing across the tarmac behind her, too late, always too late. Security personnel realizing the aircraft they were supposed to be guarding was already 300 feet up and climbing. Casey's voice came through the headset, clipped and professional despite everything. "Course heading 310. Terrain rises sharp past the first ridgeline. We'll want altitude before we lose radar contact with Eli's ground station. Copy that. For what it's worth." A pause. Static filling the space where Casey chose her next words carefully. "I looked up your father's service record last night, before any of this happened. Before Voss called. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe. Some instinct." Dakota's hand stayed steady on the controls, even as something in her chest went very still. "And there's a gap in it. 6 weeks right before he died, completely unaccounted for. No flight logs. No deployment orders. Like those 6 weeks didn't happen at all." Dakota said nothing. Because she'd found that same gap herself years ago and had never once figured out what filled it. Below them, the terrain began to change. Flat scrubland giving way to broken rock, rising ridgelines, cutting the horizon into jagged teeth, the land folding in on itself the way it always did right before it turned hostile. Fog sat low in the draws between the ridges, exactly the way Eli had described, thick enough to swallow a man standing 20 feet away. Eli's voice crackled through tighter now, the ground station relay picking up something Dakota couldn't yet see. "Reaper, be advised. I'm picking up chatter on Ironhorse's last known frequency. Broken, but it's out there. Hold your approach vector. I'm trying to get a fix on their position before you're overhead." "How bad?" Dakota said. "Bad enough that I'd rather you heard it from me than found out on your own." A pause radio hiss, filling the gap. "Whoever's got them pinned down isn't shooting randomly into the fog anymore, Dakota. They're calling out names. Voss's name. Yours." Dakota's grip tightened on the stick. "They know I'm coming," she said. "They knew before you took off," Eli said. which means somewhere between that phone call this morning and right now, somebody told them. The aircraft bucked once as she dropped through a pocket of turbulence wind shear, kicking up off the ridgeline the way it always did in terrain like this, and for half a second her stomach dropped with it. Not from the altitude. From the memory, the altitude dragged up behind it, unbidden, every briefing she'd ever sat through as a child at her father's kitchen table. Every diagram he'd drawn on a napkin explaining how wind moved through a valley like this one, how it could lift you or kill you depending on whether you respected it. She respected it now more than she ever had. "Talk to me, Eli," she said. "I need eyes before I commit to this run." Working on it. Ground stations picking up fragments, nothing clean. Whatever jamming they're running, it's good. Better than it should be for the kind of outfit that's supposedly holding that ridge. A pause key's clicking somewhere on his end. That bothers me, Dakota. Small units running that kind of electronic warfare capability out here in the middle of nowhere. That's not a lucky ambush. That's infrastructure. That's planning. Save the analysis. Give me a heading. 285, hold your altitude until you're past the second ridge, then drop to get under the cloud deck. Voss's last confirmed position is along the eastern face. But that was 6 hours ago, and 6 hours is a long time to still be alive up there. Ahead, through a gap in the fog, she caught her first glimpse of the ridge. Muzzle flashes small and orange, stuttering against gray rock. Smoke rising in a thin column from somewhere near the summit. And past all of it, unmistakable, even from this altitude, the wreckage of something old and half-buried in scree. A shape she recognized in her bones before her mind had finished processing what she was looking at. The tail section of an aircraft, weathered by 12 years of wind and snow and silence. Her father's aircraft. Still there, still waiting, exactly where the official report said it could never have been found. "Casey," Dakota said, voice flat, controlled the calm of someone standing very carefully at the edge of something enormous. "Tell me you're seeing what I'm seeing." "I'm seeing it," Casey said quietly. "I don't understand it, but I'm seeing it." Below them, the valley that had swallowed her father whole 12 years ago, opened up to receive her fog, curling along the ridgelines like something breathing gunfire flashing in the gray morning light. 31 men, somewhere in the smoke, still waiting on a miracle nobody upstairs had approved. Dakota Shaw pushed the throttle forward and dropped the nose toward the fight. Whatever answers were waiting for her down there, she was done running from them. Behind her, unseen, unremarked, a strange thought surfaced and refused to leave. The way Eli's voice had gone quiet over that relay routing. The way Ashford's connection had carried a texture no administrative office line should carry. Small things. The kind of things a person filed away without understanding the way you notice a draft in a house before you ever find the window that's letting it in. She didn't have time to chase it now. But some part of her, the part that had spent 12 years learning to distrust official explanations, made a quiet promise to come back to it once the 31 men below her were safe. Because some doors, once you notice they're open, don't stay unopened for long. The first pass came in low. Too low, some part of Dakota's brain screamed the part trained by regulation, the part that had sat through 1,000 safety briefings, insisting on minimum altitudes and standoff distances. She ignored it. Because regulation didn't know this valley. Regulation had never buried anyone here. Below the fog, 31 men were counting on a woman who wasn't supposed to be flying this aircraft in a valley that officially didn't exist against an enemy nobody could yet explain. The math of it should have terrified her more than it did. Instead, it settled into her chest like something familiar. Something she'd been carrying so long it had stopped feeling like weight and started feeling like posture. Muzzle flashes strobed along the eastern ridge, and she banked hard, the horizon tilting sideways, in the canopy fog whipping past the wings, in gray streamers that broke apart and reformed like something alive. Below her, the terrain unfolded exactly the way it had lived in her memory for 12 years. Exactly the way her father had once traced it across a paper napkin at their kitchen table forefinger. Dragging along an imaginary ridgeline, while a much younger version of her sat cross-legged on a chair too big for her, memorizing every word without knowing why it would matter someday. "Wind moves down through here, Dot," comes off the high ground and funnels straight through the draw. You respect that wind, or it kills you before the enemy gets the chance. She respected it now. She felt it now, shoving against the fuselage in short testing gusts, the aircraft answering each one with the shudder that meant the margins up here were thinner than any simulator had ever bothered to model. "Talk to me, Eli," she said. "Where's Voss?" "Ground station's still fighting the jamming. Best I've got is the last confirmed grid, but that's 20 minutes stale, and I don't like operating on stale numbers in terrain like this." 20 minutes is a lifetime up here. "I know it. Working on it." Casey's voice cut through tight controlled. "I've got thermal returns along the draw, multiple heat signatures. Could be friendlies, could be hostiles, can't tell from this altitude." "Then we go lower." "Lower puts us inside their effective range." "Lower puts me close enough to see faces," Dakota said. "I'm not putting a gun run on a position until I know who's standing on it." She dropped the nose. The altimeter unwound faster than comfortable, faster than anything Casey's 4 years of by-the-book flying had ever prepared her to watch happen from the front seat of an aircraft she wasn't supposed to be in. 800 feet, Casey said. 7. "Dakota, this is—" "I see them." Because she did. Shapes resolving out of fog and smoke, resolving into men, resolving into the crouched, desperate posture of soldiers who had spent the last 11 hours believing nobody was coming. American uniforms. Faces turned up toward the sound of engines they hadn't dared to hope for. And past them on the far ridge muzzle flashes, she recognized instantly as a different kind of shooter. Disciplined. Coordinated. Not panic fire. Someone directing this. "Ground station, this is Reaper," she said into the radio voice, flattening into the calm she'd learned a long time ago. The calm that lived on the other side of fear once you stopped negotiating with it. "I have eyes on friendlies, Danger. Close requesting confirmation before I commit." Static. Then breaking through the interference, like something surfacing from deep water, a voice she hadn't heard in 18 months and would have known anywhere. "Reaper, this is Ironhorse 6. Voss. Rougher than the phone call, rougher than she'd ever heard him. "God help me, is that really you up there?" "It's me, sir." "You beautiful, insubordinate son of a—" His voice actually broke, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because some reunions don't need words, they just need the other person to still be breathing. "Talk to me about the ridge," Dakota said, pulling them both back before the moment could cost them time they didn't have. "Eastern faced 2 elevated positions, maybe 40 meters apart. They've got us boxed into the draw, no clean line to pull back. If you can suppress that eastern face, we might be able to move the wounded." "Copy. Danger close, confirm." "Danger close, confirmed. Bring it in tight, Reaper. We don't have room for error up here." She rolled the aircraft, lined the nose on the eastern ridge, and felt the old rhythm come back to her hands, the way a language comes back after years of not speaking it. Not clumsy, not rusty, just waiting. 18 months of grounding, of paperwork, of watching other pilots walk past her toward aircraft she wasn't cleared to touch, and none of it had actually taken anything away. It had just been sitting dormant, folded up somewhere behind her ribs. The same way her father's dog tag sat folded in her jacket pocket, waiting for exactly this kind of morning to remember what it was for. The gun spoke. It wasn't loud so much as total a sound that filled the whole aircraft and the whole valley at once, and the eastern ridge erupted in a line of impacts that walked exactly where she'd aimed them, exactly where Voss's men needed them, because some skills don't fade, just because the Air Force decides to stop letting you use them. Below, through the fog, she caught the briefest impression of soldiers ducking and then rising, ducking, and rising, the jagged motion of men who had spent hours flinching from incoming fire, suddenly remembering what it felt like to move without dying for it. "Splash," she said. "Ironhorse say status." Silence. Then Voss's voice, rough with something that might have been relief or might have been disbelief that any of this was actually working. "Eastern positions quiet. You bought us room, Reaper. Moving wounded now." "Copy. I'm coming back around for a second pass. Keep your heads down. Don't get comfortable down there, Colonel." She banked the aircraft into a wide-turn fog curling past the canopy and allowed herself exactly 1 second to feel something like triumph before Eli's voice cut through the headset, urgent in a way that told her the mission had just changed shape. Reaper, be advised. I'm reading a third position. West Ridge, previously quiet, now active. And Dakota? A pause, the pause of a man choosing his next words very carefully. That position wasn't there 10 minutes ago. Somebody moved into it after your first pass. They're adjusting to me, Dakota said slowly. They're not adjusting, Eli said. They're anticipating. Whoever's running this knows CAS tactics, knows exactly how a pilot thinks about repositioning after a gun run. That's not insurgent improvisation, Dakota. That's someone trained the same way you were trained. The cockpit went very quiet. Just engine noise. Just the silence that follows a sentence too large to process while you're also flying an aircraft through hostile airspace. Say that again, Dakota said. I'm saying whoever's coordinating that ridge fought the same doctrine you did. Maybe wore the same uniform once. I don't know how, and I don't know why, but that's not a guess anymore. That's a pattern. Casey's voice quieter now, less argumentative than it had been in the hangar. Dakota, if that's true, if there's someone down there who used to be one of us, then we deal with that after we get Voss's people out, Dakota said, cutting her off, because there wasn't room in her head right now for the size of what that meant. Not yet. Not while there were still men bleeding on a ridge below her. The second pass didn't go as clean. She came in from a different vector this time, trying to break whatever pattern the West Ridge shooter had anticipated. And for exactly 4 seconds, it worked the aircraft threading between the two active positions with the kind of precision that made Casey exhale something that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite relief. Then the West Ridge opened up, and something slammed into the aircraft hard enough to throw both of them against their harnesses. Warning lights bloomed across the console, red and insistent, and for one long suspended moment, nobody in the cockpit said anything at all, because the sound the aircraft made when it took a hit like that lived somewhere below language, somewhere in the part of the brain that only knows how to be afraid. Report to... Dakota said, voice tight but steady, because panic was a luxury the aircraft couldn't afford right now, even if she could. Hydraulic pressure dropping on the left side, Casey said, scanning the gauges with hands that weren't quite steady. Not critical. Not yet. But we took something in the wing. Can she fly? She's flying. I don't know for how long. Eli's voice tight with something that hadn't been there before. Dakota, that hit came from the West Ridge. Confirmed shooter position, and it wasn't small arms. That's something heavier than anyone should have up there. How much heavier? Heavier than I want to say out loud right now. Below, the fog shifted, and through the gap, Dakota caught a flash of movement along the West Ridge that didn't match anything she'd expect from the kind of fighters usually found holding terrain like this. Coordinated movement. Fire discipline. The particular economy of motion that only comes from real training, real doctrine, real time spent learning how modern air power actually gets defeated instead of just feared. Ironhorse, this is Reaper, she said. I'm hit. Still flying, still committed, but I need you to tell me everything you know about who's holding that West Ridge. Voss's voice came back thinner than before, strained under the sound of gunfire she could hear bleeding through his transmission. We don't know. That's the truth, Reaper. We came in expecting a small hostile element, maybe a dozen fighters disorganized. What's up there now isn't that. Hasn't been that since the first hour. Someone reinforced them. Someone knew we were coming, Voss said. Knew before we crossed the border. I've been turning that over for 6 hours, and I don't like where it points. Dakota's hands tightened on the stick. Where does it point, sir? The radio crackled with something that might have been static and might have been Voss, hesitating, weighing a truth against the cost of saying it out loud over an open channel. Not now, he said finally. Not on this frequency. Get my people out first, then we talk. Dakota let the silence sit for a moment, fog streaming past the canopy before keying the radio again. "Copy that, sir. But don't think I'm going to forget you said it. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Reaper. Never have." She circled the valley twice more, buying Voss's team time to drag their wounded back from the exposed draw, watching the hydraulic gauge tick downward with the patient, indifferent cruelty of machinery that didn't care how much this mission mattered. Every pass cost fuel she couldn't recover, and altitude she'd need later, and she made the trade anyway, because some costs were only obvious in hindsight, and this was not going to become one more decision she second-guessed for the next 12 years. "Fuel's getting tight too," Casey said, voice carefully neutral in the way people get neutral when they're trying not to sound as worried as they are. "We push much longer, we're not making it back to any friendly strip. We'll be landing on fumes somewhere we don't want to land." "I know. I'm not telling you to leave them. I'm telling you the math." "I hear the math, Marlowe." Dakota banked the aircraft again, scanning the ridgeline, looking for the shape of the west position through the shifting fog. "The math doesn't get to decide this one alone." Something in Casey's silence afterward felt different than the silence in the hangar that morning. Less argument. More something like understanding arriving against her will. Casey's voice broke in again a moment later. Different now, urgent in a way that wasn't about fuel or hydraulics at all. "Dakota, I need you to hear this. I've been running our transmissions back against a signal analysis app on the tablet, just background noise, while I monitored the gauges, and something's wrong. Define wrong. Our frequency. The one we've been using since takeoff. The one Eli patched us into from the ground station. It's not clean. There's a secondary carrier riding underneath it, real faint, the kind of thing you'd never catch unless you were specifically looking for it. Say what that means in words I can use right now, Marlowe. It means somebody's been listening to every word we've said since before we crossed into this valley, maybe since before we left the hangar." Casey's voice tightened further. "Which means whoever's coordinating that west ridge hasn't been reacting to what they're seeing. They've been reacting to what they're hearing. Every maneuver you called, every heading, they've had it in real time." The realization landed like another hit to the fuselage, quieter than the last one, but somehow heavier. "Eli," Dakota said. "Confirm." A long pause, the pause of a man checking something he desperately hoped not to find, and finding it anyway. "Confirmed," Eli said, voice flat with the effort of keeping it steady. "I should have caught this before you ever took off. I built that relay myself, tested it twice, and I still missed it. Whoever planted this knew exactly what frequency we'd default to, which means they knew about this mission before Voss ever called you this morning." "That's not possible," Dakota said. "Voss called me from a payphone he wasn't even supposed to have access to. Nobody knew." "Somebody knew," Eli said, "or somebody's been listening long enough that it didn't matter which phone he used." The Casey switched frequencies with fast, practiced hands, killing the compromised channel and bringing up a backup Eli had built into the relay as an afterthought, the kind of redundancy nobody expects to actually need until the day it saves their life. Switching to secondary. If they're as good as they seem, they'll find this one too eventually. But it buys us time. How much time? I don't know. Minutes, maybe. Less if whoever's listening is as thorough as everything else about this operation suggests. Dakota banked the aircraft again, scanning the ridgeline, looking for the shape of the west position through the shifting fog, and felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with altitude. Because if someone had been listening since before Voss's call, if someone had known about this mission before it existed on paper, the same way her father's mission had existed off every manifest 12 years ago, then whatever waited for her on that ridge wasn't an accident of geography. It was an invitation. Back at the ground station 40 miles from the ridge in a cramped trailer, lit by the blue glow of 3 monitors, Eli Ferris stared at the same waveform Casey had just flagged and felt his stomach drop the way it hadn't dropped since his last combat deployment. The secondary carrier signal sat there, patient and undeniable, buried underneath their primary frequency, like something placed there deliberately, professionally, by someone who understood exactly how their relay worked because they had likely helped design systems just like it. He thought about every step of building this relay. The late nights, the careful redundancies, the absolute certainty he'd felt walking Dakota through the plan that morning, the confidence of a man who believed he'd accounted for every variable that mattered. He hadn't accounted for this. He pulled up the maintenance logs for the relay equipment, cross-referencing serial numbers against requisition records, and felt something cold settle into his chest when he found what he was looking for. The relay hardware hadn't come from his own kit. It had come from base supply requisitioned through a chain of approvals that ended eventually at a signature he recognized. General Ashford's office. Eli sat back hard in his chair, the pieces arranging themselves into a shape he didn't want to look at directly. He thought about the strange texture he'd noticed on Ashford's line that morning in the hangar. The forward relay signature that didn't match a stateside desk, the comment he'd made half to himself and hadn't followed up on because there hadn't been time. He should have followed up. He'd had the thread in his hand for 3 hours and let it go slack, which meant the equipment Eli had trusted, had built his entire communication plan around, had been compromised before it ever left the supply depot. Not an accident. Not bad luck. A deliberate placement patient and calculated waiting for exactly the kind of mission that would justify its use. God help her, he muttered, keying his own radio to warn Dakota, already knowing, with the sick certainty of a man watching a disaster unfold too far away to stop it, that whatever he said next might already be too late to matter. Eli's voice broke through again, urgent, the urgency of a man who has just found something he wishes he hadn't. Reaper, be advised. Ground station's finally cutting through some of the jamming. I'm getting partial intercepts on what I think is the West Ridge's command frequency. Talk to me. It's in English, Dakota. The words landed and sat there for a moment, refusing to make sense the way words sometimes do right before they make too much sense. Say again. Clear English, military phrasing. Whoever's coordinating that position isn't speaking through a translator or broken radio discipline. They're using our terminology, our call signs. Someone up there trained in the same system you did. The cockpit felt smaller suddenly, the fog outside pressing closer, the whole valley narrowing down to a single, unbearable question. Neither of them wanted to say out loud yet. Casey, Dakota said quietly, you said my father's file had a 6-week gap. I did. What if this is where it went? Nobody answered that. Nobody had an answer that wouldn't have made the moment worse, and for a long stretch of seconds, the only sound in the cockpit was the low, steady hum of engines, still somehow holding together against damage that should have grounded them an hour ago, and the distant muffled crack of gunfire rising up through fog that refused to thin no matter how long the morning wore on. The third pass was the one that changed everything. She'd lined up on the west ridge, ready to commit the gun on the heavier position, when Eli's voice tore through the headset with a different kind of urgency, the kind reserved for information too important to wait for a clean moment to deliver it. Reaper, abort. Abort the run. I need you to see something first. I'm already committed, Eli. Talk fast. Thermal's picking up a body on the west ridge. Separate from the active shooters. Hasn't moved in the feed the whole time we've been up here. Dakota, the thermal signature reads American uniform. Her finger came off the trigger a half second before she would have fired the aircraft rolling wide of the ridge instead of through it. Adrenaline and confusion crashing into each other, somewhere behind her ribs. For one disorienting moment, she thought of every gun run she'd ever flown in training. Every simulator scenario built to test exactly this kind of split-second discipline, and understood with a clarity that felt almost like relief that no simulator had ever prepared her for how much it would cost to pull a trigger back at the very last possible instant. Say that again. There's a body up there, positioned like the others, like part of the defensive line, but it's not moving, and it's not shooting, and the thermal signature is wrong for the rest of that position. It's not local. It's not the fighters we've been engaging. Whoever that is, they were wearing an American uniform when they died. Dakota brought the aircraft around in a slow, controlled arc, every instinct in her fighting the urge to look away from what she already suspected she was about to find. "Casey, confirm what he's seeing." Casey's hands moved fast over the sensor display, and when she spoke, her voice had lost every trace of the sharp, argumentative edge she'd carried since the hangar. "He's right. I've got it too. Bodies positioned along the ridge's northern shoulder, separate cover position, consistent with someone who was directing fire rather than delivering it. And the equipment signature..." She stopped. "Finish it, Marlowe. The equipment signature matches issue gear. Not commercial. Not foreign military surplus. Ours." The valley seemed to hold its breath around them, fog curling along the ridgelines like something patient, something that had been waiting 12 years for exactly this moment to arrive. "Ironhorse, this is Reaper," Dakota said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, because some part of her had learned a long time ago how to sound calm, while everything underneath was coming apart. "I need confirmation. Do you have any American personnel unaccounted for on that West Ridge? Any liaison? Any advisor? Anyone who could explain what I'm looking at?" Voss's response took too long. Long enough that Dakota knew before he even said a word that the answer was going to reshape everything she thought she understood. About this mission, about her father, about the 12 years of silence that had led her back to this exact valley. "No," Voss said, finally, voice hollowed out by something that sounded almost like fear. "No American personnel assigned to that position. None authorized. None on any manifest." "Then who is that up there, sir?" The radio hissed with static, with distance, with the silence of a man who had spent 12 years avoiding a question he could no longer avoid. "I don't know," Voss said. "But Dakota, the position, the coordinates, the terrain. It's the same ground your father went down on. I told you I recognized it. I didn't tell you everything I recognized. Tell me now. Land first. I can't say this over an open channel with whoever's running that ridge still listening." Dakota looked at the fuel gauge, at the hydraulic pressure ticking steadily toward numbers she didn't want to reach. At Casey, whose face had gone the pale of someone doing math, she didn't like the answer to. "We don't have time to land," Dakota said. "Say it now or say it never, because in about 4 minutes, this aircraft is going to make that decision for both of us." A long pause. The longest of the entire mission. "Your father didn't crash because of weather," Voss said, finally the words coming out like something physically painful to release. "He was flying reconnaissance on a black program nobody was supposed to know existed. Something that used this exact ridge as a staging position. When the mission went wrong, Command made a call. They decided extracting him wasn't worth exposing the program. The cockpit went silent, except for the low hum of engines, straining against damage they weren't built to survive. They left him, Dakota said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of 12 years of buried certainty finally finding words. They left him, Voss confirmed. And I've spent 12 years telling myself I didn't know that for certain. I did. I've known since the week it happened. I just didn't have the courage to say it to his daughter's face. Something enormous and long contained broke open in Dakota's chest, grief and rage, arriving together in a way that had no clean edges, no place to set either one down separately. "Who gave that order?" she said, voice very quiet now, very controlled, the control of someone standing at the exact center of something too large to survive feeling all at once. "I don't have proof, not the kind that would hold up anywhere that matters." "Who gave the order, sir?" Voss's answer came through broken, half swallowed by static, but clear enough that Dakota would remember it for the rest of her life. "The same man who told you to stand down this morning." The aircraft shuddered again, hydraulic warning lights, climbing from amber into red. And somewhere below the fog, the West Ridge fell quiet, as if even the fighters holding it had felt the shape of what had just been said, crossing the sky above them. "Dakota!" Casey's voice, careful now, urgent, in a different register than before. "We need to make a decision. Fuel hydraulics, we're past the point where staying up here is a choice we get to keep making." Dakota looked down at the ridge one more time. At the body that didn't belong there, wearing a uniform that shouldn't have been on that ground, carrying 12 years of silence inside whatever was left of it. At Voss's people moving slow and wounded through fog toward whatever thin hope of extraction still existed. At the wreckage of her father's aircraft, still visible through a gap in the mist, exactly where it had waited for her the whole time she'd spent trying not to think about it. "Ironhorse," she said. "I'm coming down. Not the aircraft. Me. I need eyes on that body before we do anything else, and I need it before Command finds a way to bury this again." "Negative, Reaper," Voss said immediately. "You land in this terrain, you're not getting back up. Not with the hydraulics you're describing. I know. Then you understand what you're asking. I understand exactly what I'm asking, sir." Dakota's hands were steady on the controls, even as everything else in her felt like it was coming apart at the seams. "Somebody up there has been buried under paperwork for 12 years. I'm done letting that happen to people I love." Casey's breath caught sharp audible even over the headset. "Dakota, if you put this aircraft down in hostile terrain with active shooters still on the West Ridge, then you and Eli are going to have to trust me the way I trusted both of you this morning," Dakota said. "Because I am not flying away from this valley twice in one lifetime, and I don't intend to start now." The engines strained. The fog thickened along the draw below, swallowing the wreckage, swallowing the body on the ridge, swallowing 31 men who had spent this entire day believing help might never actually come. And somewhere above all of it, an aircraft that wasn't supposed to be flying. Carrying a pilot who wasn't supposed to be flying, it began its final, irreversible descent toward the one place on Earth she'd spent 12 years trying to forget. The landing wasn't a landing so much as a controlled crash that happened to leave everyone breathing afterward. She brought the aircraft down on a stretch of relatively flat scrub, 200 meters from the draw. The landing gear shrieking against terrain, never meant to receive it. The whole airframe shuddering with a violence that threw Casey hard against her harness and left Dakota's teeth clenched so tight her jaw ached for an hour afterward. They rolled to a stop at an angle nobody would have called textbook. Smoke curled from the damaged wing. Somewhere behind them, the sound of gunfire hadn't stopped, hadn't even paused, because the West Ridge didn't care that an aircraft had just committed itself to the ground beside them. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. The silence inside the cockpit felt enormous compared to everything that had just happened. And Dakota found herself doing the strange automatic thing pilots do after surviving something they shouldn't have. Checking her own hands, her own chest, confirming with her own eyes that she was still whole before trusting anything else. "You alive, Marlowe?" "Debatable," Casey said, voice shaking only slightly, some dry thread of humor surfacing even now, the same stubborn instinct that had carried her through the entire hangar argument that morning. "Ask me again once we're not sitting inside a burning aircraft in the middle of a firefight." "Out," Dakota said, already unbuckling. "Now, we don't have time to admire the landing. Time." Casey didn't argue. She'd stopped arguing somewhere over the last 20 minutes, the way people do when the stakes stop being theoretical and start being immediate. They hit the ground running Dakota with a sidearm she hadn't touched in 18 months, but whose weight settled into her palm like something she'd never actually put down Casey close behind her with a rifle pulled from the aircraft's survival kit, both of them low and fast, across terrain that offered exactly no cover and every reason to hurry. Eli's voice crackled through the shoulder-mounted radio, tinny and distant, now that they were on foot instead of airborne. "Dakota, talk to me. I lost visual the second you went below the ridgeline. We're down. We're moving toward Voss's position. West Ridge is still hot. I say again, still hot. I know it's hot, Eli. I was just shot at by it. Save the warnings and get me something useful instead." They reached the mouth of the draw in under 2 minutes. Lungs burning fog thick enough now that visibility had collapsed to 20 feet in every direction, and found Voss himself crouched behind a slab of rock older than she remembered. Grayer blood soaking through a hasty dressing on his shoulder that he hadn't mentioned over the radio. "You're insane," Voss said, staring at her like she was something conjured out of the fog rather than a person who had actually walked here. Completely certifiably insane. You called me, sir. I called for air support, not for you to land in the middle of an active engagement. Same thing where I'm standing. Something that might have been a laugh, rough and disbelieving, escaped him, despite everything. You really are his daughter. Where's the body, sir? The one on the West Ridge. I need to see it before that position gets reinforced again. I've come too far to turn back without an answer now. Voss's expression shifted, the brief relief of her arrival collapsing into something heavier and far more complicated than gratitude. Dakota, listen to me. Whatever's up there, whoever that is, it's not going to give you the answers you're hoping for. Not the clean ones. I need you to prepare yourself for that before you go looking. I've had 12 years to prepare myself, sir. I'm not stopping now. She moved past him before he could argue further, Casey at her shoulder, both of them threading through fog and broken rock toward the West Ridge's northern shoulder, where a handful of Voss's remaining soldiers had pulled back to a defensible position and were laying down suppressing fire toward shapes that came and went in the mist like something more suggested than seen. A young soldier, the one Voss had been unable to remember the last name of, Danny Forearm, wrapped in a dressing gone dark with blood, looked up as they approached and said the only thing that seemed to matter to him in that moment. Ma'am, are you really going to get us out of here? Dakota crouched beside him, checked the dressing with hands that hadn't lost the old field training despite everything, and looked him in the eye the way her father used to look at frightened new pilots before their first real mission. How old are you, soldier? She asked, because sometimes the smallest questions carry the most weight. 22, ma'am. 8 months in. You got somebody waiting on you back home. My mom. She thinks I'm doing training exercises. He laughed, thin and shaky, the laugh of someone trying to hold himself together through sheer will. She's gonna kill me when she finds out what training exercises actually look like. What's her name? Dakota asked, tying off the fresh dressing with quick, practiced hands. Your mother. Linda, ma'am. Linda Ochoa. Why? Because if this goes the way I intend it to, I want to be able to tell her exactly who her son was out here. Not a training exercise. A soldier who held a position for 11 hours without breaking. Danny's eyes went bright, and he looked away fast, blinking hard, embarrassed at being caught feeling something too large for the moment to hold. Yeah, Dakota said. I am. She didn't know if it was true. She said it anyway because some lies are the only kindness left available in a moment like this one. And because she intended to make it true, regardless of what it cost her. Voss watched the exchange from a few feet away, something unreadable crossing his weathered face, and when Dakota finally rose to move toward the ridge's northern shoulder, he caught her arm briefly just once. Your father would have done exactly this, he said quietly. Landed the aircraft, walked into the fire. I used to tell myself that's what got him killed. Maybe I was wrong about that too. Maybe he just understood something the paperwork never could, Dakota said. And what's that? That some people are worth the risk, even when command says otherwise. The northern shoulder of the ridge was worse than the thermal imagery had suggested. Smoke hung low over broken rock, and the smell reached her before the sight did the smell. That doesn't belong to any single conflict or country. The smell that every soldier who has ever stood on ground like this recognizes instantly and never quite forgets. The body lay exactly where Casey's readout had placed it, positioned along a shallow defensive cut in the rock, uniform faded and weathered in a way that told Dakota even before she crossed the last few meters that this person had not died today, had not died recently at all. She knelt beside it slowly, Casey covering the approach with the rifle, and reached for the collar with hands that had gone strangely steady now that the moment had actually arrived. A name tape faded but legible. She stared at it for a long moment, fog curling around her gunfire, somewhere behind them, rising and falling like something breathing, and felt 12 years of carefully maintained silence collapse all at once into a single, unbearable certainty. Because the name on that uniform wasn't her father's. But it was a name she recognized instantly, a name from the same squadron roster she had memorized as a teenager, grieving a man the Air Force insisted had died alone. A name belonging to someone who was supposed to have retired quietly years ago to a life nobody had ever questioned. She remembered him distantly, from a handful of childhood memories she hadn't thought about in years. A broad-shouldered man in dress uniform at a Christmas party, laughing too loud, shaking her father's hand like they shared something the rest of the room wasn't allowed to know about. She remembered her father going quiet for the rest of that evening. Quiet in the way of a man who had just been reminded of something he'd rather forget. "Casey," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Get Eli on the line, right now." "What is it?" Dakota looked up at her, and whatever was on her face made Casey stop breathing for a moment before she even answered. "Colonel Frank Whitmore," Dakota said, reading the faded name tape a second time to be certain. This man didn't just fight up here. He trained the people shooting at us. And 12 years ago, he was supposed to be 3,000 miles away, retired filing paperwork nobody ever double-checked. He commanded the squadron 2 levels above my father back before I was old enough to understand what that meant. Casey keyed the radio, hands shaking now, despite everything, and the moment the channel opened, a voice cut through that neither of them expected, and both of them recognized instantly. "This is General Ashford. I am ordering an immediate recall of all personnel from that location." His voice carried none of the earlier composure, stretched thin over something that sounded almost like panic, wearing the costume of authority. "Captain Shaw, you are to withdraw immediately. This is not a request." Dakota keyed her own radio, kneeling beside the body and the fog gunfire still rattling somewhere behind her. "General, how did you get on this frequency?" A pause longer than it should have taken a man to answer a simple question. "That's irrelevant, Captain." "It's the only relevant thing left, sir. This channel was supposed to be secure. Which means either you've had eyes on this operation the entire time, or somebody's been feeding you everything I've said since I left the hangar this morning." "You are disobeying a direct order for the second time today," Ashford said, voice climbing towards something sharper. "There will be no third chance, Captain. Withdraw now, or I promise you the consequences will follow you for the rest of whatever career you think you still have." Voss's voice broke in from somewhere behind her, rough with exhaustion and disbelief. "General, with respect, we have wounded up here and a hostile element that just took down an aircraft. This is not the moment for a chain of command argument." "This is exactly the moment, Colonel," Ashford snapped back. "Because what Captain Shaw is currently looking at was never supposed to be found. And now that it has been, this operation is compromised beyond anything either of you understands." The radio went dead, cut off mid-transmission, the abruptness of someone realizing they'd said more than they intended and severing the connection before they could say anything worse. Dakota stared at the silent radio for a long moment, fog curling around her, the name tape still cold under her fingers. "He knew," she said quietly. "He knew what was up here before we ever found it." "Which means he's known the whole time," Casey said. "Since before you took off. Maybe since before Voss ever called you. Which means everything he told me this morning about this operation not existing was never about protecting paperwork," Casey finished. "It was about protecting whoever's still standing on that ridge." Dakota let that settle for a moment, 12 years of buried grief, reorganizing itself around a shape that finally had edges instead of fog. Behind them, the West Ridge erupted with fresh gunfire closer now. And somewhere in the fog, a voice began shouting orders, in clear, unmistakable English orders that used call signs. Dakota recognized tactics. She recognized a rhythm of command she had learned a long time ago from the same man whose name was stitched onto the collar in her hands. Because whoever had been running this ridge, whoever had known her, heading her frequency, her father's coordinates, 12 years before she ever flew into this valley herself, was still out there, still alive, still very much in command of the men trying to kill them. "Movement," Voss said, dropping low beside her, rifle up, eyes scanning the fog with the sharpness of a man who had spent this entire day learning to trust his instincts over his eyes. 40 meters, maybe less. Coming this way. Dakota lowered the dead man's collar gently, the way you'd set down something that deserved more ceremony than a battlefield could offer, and rose with her sidearm ready, every old instinct settling back into her body like something that had never actually left. Because there wasn't time to grieve a stranger whose name explained 12 years of silence. There wasn't time to feel the size of what Ashford had just confirmed half by accident over an open channel. There was only the fog and the sound of boots moving through it, and 31 men who still needed to survive whatever happened in the next 60 seconds. Casey moved into position beside her without being told rifle steady despite everything. And for one strange moment, Dakota thought of the hangar that morning. The argument about doctrine, the version of Casey Marlowe who had called all of this a death wish with extra steps. That version of Casey seemed to belong to a different lifetime, now replaced by someone who had learned in the space of a single impossible morning exactly which regulations were worth breaking and exactly what they cost. "Casey," Dakota said, voice low, flat, the calm that lives on the far side of fear once you stop negotiating with it. "Whatever's coming through that fog, we hold this line." "And if it's him," Casey said. "Whoever's been running this the whole time." Dakota's grip tightened on the sidearm, the name tape still burning somewhere behind her eyes, 12 years of unanswered questions finally arriving at the edge of an answer she wasn't sure she was ready to survive. "Then I finally get to ask him the question I've been carrying since I was 15 years old," she said. The fog shifted. A shape resolved out of the gray, tall, deliberate moving with the unmistakable economy of someone who had commanded men in terrain like this for longer than Dakota had been alive. And somewhere behind that shape, through the smoke and the dying light, the shouting continued in a voice that Dakota realized with a cold and total certainty she had heard once before, not on a radio, years ago, at a funeral. Standing 3 rows back, refusing to meet a 15-year-old girl's eyes while she held a flag that was far too heavy for hands that young to carry alone. The shape stopped 10 meters from her, fog curling around it like something reluctant to let go of what it was hiding. For one long second, nobody moved. The gunfire behind them seemed to fade into background noise, the way a ringing phone fades once you've decided not to answer it, because whatever was about to happen in the next few seconds mattered more than anything the battle still had left to offer. And then it stepped forward, and the fog gave up what it had been holding. And Dakota Shaw found herself looking at the face she had spent 12 years trying to remember correctly, and had somehow, despite everything, remembered exactly right. "General Ashford," she said. Not a question, not surprise even, just a name finally attached to the right body after 12 years of attaching it to nothing but a folded flag and a pair of shoes she'd stared at instead of a face. "Captain Shaw." He held a rifle loosely professionally, the posture of a man who had commanded soldiers longer than she'd been alive and had never once forgotten how to hold a weapon like it belonged to him. "You should have stood down this morning. I gave you every opportunity to walk away from this. You gave me a lie this morning. I gave you an order. Same thing coming from you." Dakota's sidearm stayed level steady, though everything underneath her ribs had turned to something molten and uncontrollable. "You were at my father's funeral, standing 3 rows back. I remember your shoes because you wouldn't look at my face." Something flickered behind Ashford's eyes. Not quite guilt. Something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has spent 12 years constructing an explanation he never expected to have to give out loud. "Your father was a good pilot," Ashford said. "Better than good. And he found something out here he was never supposed to find. And I made a decision that day. I have lived with every single day since." "You left him." "I protected a program that kept this country safer than you will ever be cleared to understand." "He was a person," Dakota said, and her voice cracked on the word in a way she hadn't intended. 12 years of careful composure finally splitting open in the worst possible moment. Not a variable, not a cost. A person with a daughter who waited on a runway for a plane that was never coming home. Ashford's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know what that cost? I have carried your father's name for 12 years, Captain. I have carried it into every promotion, every decoration, every night I couldn't sleep. Don't presume to tell me I don't understand the weight of it. You have a strange way of showing it, General. Standing on this exact ground, 12 years later, still choosing the program over the people standing in front of you. And how exactly does a man who's supposed to be commanding a desk 3,000 miles away end up standing on this ridge in under an hour? Because I never went home after your father died. Ashford said something raw, finally breaking through the composure. I've spent 12 years running this program from a forward post 200 miles from this exact valley, telling my own family I was stationed somewhere safe. When Voss's unit stumbled into our perimeter last night, I was already close enough to reach it myself. That's the arithmetic of guilt, Captain. It keeps you exactly where the mistake happened, waiting to see if it ever stops being a mistake. I came out here myself. Ashford went on quieter now. Not from behind a desk, not through a radio 1,000 miles away. Because when I realized what your arrival meant, I understood I owed it to your father to at least be present for whatever happened next. That's not nothing, Captain, whatever else you think of me. It's not enough. No. Ashford agreed, quiet now, something almost hollow entering his voice. It never will be. But it's what I have left to offer, and I intend to offer all of it before this day decides how it wants to end. Then why is this happening again? Voss said, stepping up beside Dakota, rifle raised, despite the blood soaking through his shoulder dressing. Why is there a black program running through this exact valley 12 years later, General? Why are there men shooting at American soldiers to protect it? Ashford's eyes moved to Voss, something calculating settling into them that hadn't been there a moment before. Because the program never actually ended, Colonel. It just changed hands, changed names. And when your unit stumbled into its perimeter 11 hours ago, I did what I have always done when the mission requires a sacrifice nobody signs a form for. You tried to bury us, Voss said. I tried to protect something larger than either of you can currently see. Dakota's grip on the sidearm didn't waver, though something in her chest had gone very cold, very still. The stillness of a person standing at the exact center of an answer they'd wanted for 12 years, and discovering it didn't feel like relief at all. It felt like grief with new information attached. What is the program? She said quietly. What was worth my father's life? What's worth 31 more today? And who was Whitmore to any of it? Something crossed Ashford's face at the name, brief and unguarded, the look of a man forced to speak a truth he'd rehearsed avoiding for years. Frank trained every fighter on that ridge personally, had for years. When he recognized your call sign over the intercepted frequency this morning, something in him finally broke. He tried to radio a warning to Voss's unit, tried to give away our position rather than let another Shaw die on this ground the way your father did. His own men shot him for it before he got the message out. Ashford's jaw worked once, twice before he continued. Frank Whitmore spent 12 years telling himself the same lie I told myself. That the program justified the cost. He changed his mind about 30 seconds too late to matter. He came to our house, Dakota said quietly, the memory surfacing whole and unwelcome. Christmas when I was small. Brought wine my father couldn't afford to serve back, laughed too loud at his own jokes. That sounds like Frank. My father stopped inviting him after that. Never told me why. Because your father saw what the rest of us took years to see, Ashford said. That Frank had already started trading pieces of himself away, for access, for rank, for the comfort of believing he was protecting something larger than his own conscience. I watched it happen to him the same way I watched it happen to myself. And I told myself for 12 years that it was different in my case. It wasn't. It never is. Dakota absorbed that in silence, the weight of it settling somewhere she didn't yet have room for. Ashford's expression shifted, something almost like regret moving across it before he caught it and locked it back down beneath the composure of a man who had spent a career learning to hide exactly this kind of feeling. "The program itself I am not authorized to tell you," he said. "Even now." "Even now," Dakota repeated, and something in the way she said it made the fog around them feel colder than it had a moment before. "You're standing in a valley with a rifle in your hands, commanding fighters against American soldiers, and you're still worried about authorization. The habits of 30 years don't disappear just because the day has gone badly," Ashford said. The gunfire that had been rattling somewhere behind them all this time chose that exact moment to surge closer, sharper. And Dakota realized with a cold lurch that the standoff they were having wasn't happening in isolation. It was happening inside a battle that hadn't paused for any of it. "Movement west flank." Casey called, rifle swinging toward a shape emerging from the fog behind Ashford, and for one suspended half-second, nobody knew whose shape it was, friendly or hostile, until the muzzle flash answered the question for all of them at once. Voss went down first, the round catching him high in the chest, and the sound he made going to his knees was smaller than Dakota expected. Quieter, almost apologetic, like even his body didn't want to make more of a disturbance than the moment already contained. Marcus, Dakota was on the ground beside him, before conscious thought caught up with her body hands, finding the wound with the automatic precision of training. She'd never actually stopped carrying pressure applied before the part of her brain that understood how bad this was had finished processing the information. Because that's what training does in the end. It takes over when grief would otherwise freeze you solid. It gives your hands a job to do, while your heart tries to catch up with what your eyes just watched happen. "Marcus, stay with me. Stay with me, do you hear me?" "Reaper." Voss's voice came out wet thin, the thinness that terrified her more than any amount of blood. "Guess I finally understand what your father felt like, watching the ground come up too fast." "Don't talk like that. Don't you dare talk like that. Somebody has to say the parts that matter before it's too late to say them." His hand found her wrist, weak but insistent. "I should have told you the truth years ago. Should have driven to that lake myself, instead of hiding behind a phone call. I told myself I was protecting you from a burden you shouldn't have to carry. Truth is, I was protecting myself from having to watch your face while I said it. You told me today. That's what matters. Today might be too late." A wet cough interrupted him, and for a moment his eyes lost focus entirely, before finding her again with visible effort. "The program, Ashford's program. There's a manifest. Buried in the wreckage of your father's aircraft coordinates. I gave you 12 years too late to matter. He found proof before he died, Dakota. Real proof. He hid it where he thought only someone who loved him enough to keep looking would ever find it. Marcus, stay with me. Firebase Cedar." Voss said the words, costing him something visible, something that pulled at whatever strength he had left. "The designation on the file. Find it. Finish what he started." His hand went slack in hers. Not dead, not yet, but close enough that the difference had stopped feeling like comfort. Casey dropped to her knees on Voss's other side, tearing open a fresh dressing with hands that had gone steady despite everything. The steadiness that arrives exactly when panic would otherwise be easier. "Pressure, keep the pressure exactly where it is. I need you to talk to me while I work. Colonel, keep those eyes open." "You're bossy." Voss managed a ghost of something like humor surfacing even through the pain. "Reminds me of somebody." "Everybody keeps saying that today," Casey said, not looking up from the wound. "I'm starting to take it as a compliment." Ashford watched the scene with an expression Dakota couldn't read. Something conflicted moving beneath the composed surface he'd worn since he stepped out of the fog. "Get him out of here," he said abruptly, and the command in his voice carried an authority that made two of his own fighters hesitate before obeying, uncertain, glancing at each other in the confusion of men who had been given an order that didn't match the mission they thought they were executing. "What are you doing?" Dakota said, staring up at him from where she knelt over Voss. "I said get him evacuated," Ashford snapped, and for the first time since the fog had given him up, something in his voice sounded less like a man protecting a program and more like a man watching a debt come due that he had spent 12 years trying not to owe. I am not going to let a second Shaw die on this exact ground because of decisions I made before either of you were fully grown. You expect me to believe you have a conscience. I expect you to accept help when it's offered, Captain, because your colonel doesn't have time for you to keep arguing about who's offering it. Casey moved fast, applying a proper dressing, while two of Ashford's own soldiers, looking deeply unhappy about the reversal, helped stabilize Voss for movement. Something about the scene refused to resolve into anything simple. The man who had ordered her father abandoned 12 years ago was in this exact moment the reason Voss might survive the next hour. Dakota looked up at Ashford, 12 years of hatred and 12 years of grief tangled together into something that had no clean name. "This doesn't fix what you did," she said. "I'm not asking it to," Ashford said quietly. "I'm asking you to let the man breathe long enough to hate me properly later. Right now, we have bigger problems than either of our consciences." The bigger problem announced itself 2 minutes later as the distinctive sound of rotor blades cut through the fog from somewhere beyond the ridge, growing steadily louder, approaching from the direction Ashford's own fighters had originally staged their reinforcement. "That's not one of ours!" Eli's voice crackled through the radio, urgent, cutting through the chaos of the moment. "Dakota, I'm reading an unregistered aircraft inbound to your position. Whoever's flying it isn't on any friendly manifest I can access." Ashford's expression changed the moment the sound registered something like genuine alarm, breaking through the composed authority he'd carried since stepping out of the fog. For the first time since he'd emerged from the mist, Dakota saw something in his face that looked less like a general and more like an old man who had just realized his own reckoning had arrived faster than he'd calculated. "That's not mine," he said. And for the first time, Dakota believed him without reservation, because the fear in his voice wasn't performance. "That's the extraction team for the program's actual leadership. Someone above me in this chain decided this operation had become too exposed to survive, which means they're not coming to reinforce us." "Then what are they coming for?" Casey said, not looking up from where she worked to stabilize Voss. "To remove every trace of what happened here," Ashford said, "including everyone who witnessed it. Including me, Captain. I built this program to survive scrutiny. I never built it to survive a witness willing to die proving it existed. So the very men you've spent 12 years protecting are about to kill you too." Dakota said something almost like disbelief entering her voice, despite everything. "That's the nature of programs built on secrets, Captain," Ashford said quietly. "Eventually they run out of people worth protecting and start protecting only themselves." The rotor sound grew louder, and through a gap in the fog, Dakota caught her first glimpse of it. A dark, unmarked aircraft, moving fast and low. The silhouette of something built for exactly this kind of deniable operation. No markings, no transponder. Nothing that would ever connect it to any government that might one day be asked uncomfortable questions. "They're going to bury this the same way they buried my father," Dakota said, understanding arriving in her chest like something physically cold. "Yes," Ashford said. "And this time they'll bury me along with the rest of you because a general who let this much unravel is a liability nobody upstairs will want breathing long enough to testify." The math arrived fast and ugly. Voss needed evacuation before his condition deteriorated past the point of saving. The unmarked aircraft was closing on their position with clear hostile intent. And somewhere in the wreckage of her father's downed aircraft, less than half a mile away, through fog and broken rock, sat the one piece of physical proof that could finally make 12 years of silence answer for itself. "I need to reach the wreckage," Dakota said, "before that aircraft gets here. You need to get your colonel out of this valley before he bleeds to death in front of you." Casey said, voice sharp with an urgency that had nothing to do with old arguments about doctrine and everything to do with a fear she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. "I can't do both." "Then choose," Casey said, and something in her voice had changed completely since the hangar that morning, some careful respect built out of everything they'd survived together in the last few hours. "Because I've watched you make the impossible choice all day, and every single time you found a way through it that nobody else would have thought to try. So find it again. Right now." Dakota looked at Voss, pale and unconscious, now breathing shallow but steady, carried between two soldiers toward whatever thin extraction route remained open. She looked at the fog concealing her father's wreckage, 12 years of buried truth waiting less than half a mile away. She looked at the sky, where the unmarked aircraft banked into its final approach, close enough now that she could make out the shape of a door gunner positioning behind a mounted weapon. And she thought with the sudden total clarity of someone finally seeing the whole shape of a problem at once that maybe the choice wasn't actually a choice at all. Maybe it was a sequence if she was fast enough, if she was exact enough, if 12 years of training and 12 years of grief could finally align into something precise enough to matter. Because that's what her father used to say, wasn't it? Every impossible problem is just 3 possible problems standing too close together. Separate them. Solve them one at a time. Trust your hands to remember what your mind is too afraid to promise. "Eli," she said into the radio, "tell me the aircraft's exact heading and I'll tell you the craziest idea I've ever had." There was a pause on the line, the pause of a man who had spent an entire day listening to Dakota Shaw propose increasingly reckless ideas and had run out of new ways to express his concern about all of them. At this point, Eli said finally, "I'm almost more worried when you don't have a plan. Give me the heading requirements and I'll get you what I can." That's not reassuring, Eli. Wasn't meant to be, just efficient. A pause keys clicking somewhere on his end. "Heading 290 altitude climbing ETA to your position under 3 minutes. Whatever you're about to do, Dakota, you need to do it faster than that." The plan, such as it was, required exactly 3 things to work in perfect sequence, and Dakota Shaw had approximately 4 minutes to make all 3 of them happen. First, Casey needed to get Voss and the wounded moving toward the extraction route. Ashford's remaining fighters were now, however, reluctantly helping secure. Second, Eli needed to guide the unmarked aircraft's approach vector through the ground station's remaining sensor feed, giving Dakota a window of maybe 90 seconds to intercept it before it reached effective firing range on the extraction party. Third, and by far the most insane of the 3, Dakota needed to reach her father's downed wreckage, retrieve whatever Voss believed was hidden there, and somehow do all of it while simultaneously buying time against an aircraft built specifically to eliminate exactly the kind of witnesses she had become. "You're going to get yourself killed," Ashford said, watching her check the sidearm's remaining rounds, with something that might have been respect fighting its way through 12 years of guilt, an old soldier's instinct for recognizing courage even when it was aimed against him. "Probably," Dakota said, "but not before I finish what he started. Let me help." "You've done enough helping for one lifetime, General." "Then let me do something that isn't for me," Ashford said. And something in his voice cracked open in a way Dakota hadn't expected, the composed authority finally giving way to something that looked for the first time since the fog had revealed him like an old man who had spent 12 years waiting for exactly this chance to matter. "I have a flare gun. If I draw that aircraft's attention toward my position instead of the extraction route, it buys you the window you need." That's not a plan. That's a suicide gesture, and you know it as well as I do. "Then let an old man make one useful gesture before the day decides how it wants to remember him," Ashford said. "I owed your father a debt I have spent 12 years failing to pay. Let this finally be the payment, however small it comes too late to matter." Dakota stared at him for one long moment, 12 years of hatred colliding with something that refused, despite everything, to be quite that simple. "You understand I'm not forgiving you," she said. "Not for any of it. Not for the wreckage, not for the 12 years, not for standing 3 rows back at his funeral and letting me believe it was just an accident. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Captain. I gave up any right to that a long time ago." Something in Ashford's face softened just slightly, just enough to see the man he might have been if a different decision had been made 12 years earlier. "I'm asking to be useful one time before it's too late to matter. That's all that's left for men like me. Usefulness in the absence of anything better to offer." "Don't die for the wrong reasons," she said, finally meaning it more than she expected to. "I intend to die for exactly the right one, Captain. For once in my life." She turned and ran before either of them could say anything else, because some goodbyes are easier to survive if you don't let them finish. She reached the wreckage at a dead run, saw Sergeant Mafog tearing past her, the sound of Ashford's flare gun cracking behind her, followed almost immediately by the unmarked aircraft's engine note shifting, banking hard toward the new target he'd offered it, buying exactly the window they needed. The tail section had weathered 12 years into something closer to rock than aircraft, rusted and half-buried scrub grass grown up through the broken fuselage in a way that made it look almost peaceful, almost forgotten, as if the mountain itself had spent 12 years trying to absorb the wreckage back into the landscape and erase what it represented. Dakota tore through it with hands that had gone numb to everything, except the singular need to find what her father had left behind. Memories crashing over her in fragments too fast to properly feel. Him teaching her to check oil in the truck in the driveway. Him laughing at something she couldn't now remember, head thrown back easy and unguarded in a way she'd only ever seen at home, never at the base. Him standing at the door the last time she saw him alive, saying something ordinary. Something about picking up milk on the way home from school, neither of them knowing it would be the last ordinary thing he'd ever say to her. She found the case inside a sealed compartment near what remained of the cockpit, waterproof military grade, undisturbed by 12 years of exposure, because whoever built it had built it to survive exactly this long. Inside, photographs, coordinates, a handwritten log in her father's unmistakable print documenting a black program's true scope in language, precise enough to leave no room for the kind of denial Ashford had spent 12 years hiding behind. And beneath all of it, a final page dated the day before his death, addressed in words that made Dakota's hands shake for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. I need you to know it wasn't an accident, and I need you to know I don't regret what I found, only that I couldn't protect you from what it might cost. Whatever happens, know that I loved you more than any mission ever mattered. She held the page for exactly 1 second longer than she could afford fog and gunfire, and 12 years of grief converging into something too large to hold at once. And then she folded it carefully into her jacket next to the dog tags and turned back toward whatever remained of the fight. The unmarked aircraft, drawn off course by Ashford's flare, banked back toward the ridge the moment its crew realized the deception, and Dakota watched from 100 meters away as General Ashford stood alone on an exposed outcrop and did not run. He didn't raise a weapon, didn't seek cover. He simply stood there upright in the fading light, the posture of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to stand in front of danger, and had decided for once in his life to let it find him without flinching. The door gunner opened fire. Ashford went down without a sound Dakota could hear over the distance, and the wind, and something in her chest broke open that she hadn't expected. 12 years of hatred finding no clean place to land, now that the man carrying it had spent his last minute trying, however imperfectly, to become someone worth forgiving. She wanted to hate him cleanly. She had wanted that for 12 years, a simple, uncomplicated hatred she could carry without having to examine it too closely. And now, watching him fall, she found only something messier, something that had grief and fury, and an unwelcome sliver of gratitude all tangled together in a knot she suspected she'd be picking apart for years. Dakota. Eli's voice urgent, cutting through the moment before she could let it settle into anything resembling grief. That aircraft's turning toward the extraction route. Casey and Voss are exposed. She ran. She reached the ridge's eastern approach as the unmarked aircraft came low over the draw door gunner, adjusting aim toward the small huddle of wounded and rescuers, moving as fast as their injuries allowed across open ground. And Dakota did the only thing left available to a pilot without an aircraft and a soldier without a clear shot. She fired every round the sidearm carried directly at the aircraft's cockpit glass, not expecting to bring it down, only needing to buy 3 more seconds, 4 enough for Casey to reach the tree line, with Voss enough for the extraction to complete before the gunner found his angle. The round sparked against reinforced glass and did nothing structural at all. But the pilot flinched, banked wide to avoid what he couldn't identify as harmless, and those 3 seconds were exactly enough. The aircraft circled once more, seemed to calculate the cost of a second pass against a target now vanished into tree cover, and peeled away toward the horizon. its mission of erasure abandoned somewhere in the mathematics of diminishing returns and rising exposure. Dakota stood alone on the ridge, breathing hard. The case containing her father's final testimony held against her chest like something that finally weighed exactly as much as it should have, all along. Behind her, the valley fell quiet, in a way it hadn't been quiet in 11 hours, but settling low over broken rock and the bodies of men on both sides who wouldn't be going home. The silence of a battlefield finally finished with whatever it had been asked to prove. She walked toward Ashford's position without entirely deciding to some old instinct, insisting she owe him at least the dignity of witness, and found him alive, barely breathing in shallow, uneven pulls, blood dark against the rock beneath him. "Captain." His voice was barely a whisper now, all the composed authority finally stripped away by something more honest than anything he'd said all day. "Did you find what you needed?" "I found what he left me." "Good." Something that might have been relief crossed his face, or might have been the simple absence of pain finally arriving. "Tell them the truth, Dakota. All of it. I've spent 12 years protecting the wrong thing. Don't let me finish protecting it even now." "I will." "There's a second file," Ashford said, his voice fading further with each word. "In my quarters at the forward post. Everything on the program, all of it in case I never made it back to hand it over myself. I built that file the same week your father died. I told myself I was gathering evidence to make things right eventually. I just never found the courage to decide when eventually had arrived." "Why now?" she said. "Why help now after everything?" "Because your father used to say something to me back before any of this happened," Ashford said, each word costing him more than the last. "He said a uniform doesn't make a man honorable. Only the choices underneath it do. I forgot that for 12 years. I'm remembering it exactly once, right at the end, and I suppose that will have to be enough." His hand found hers, weak cold, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, because some reckonings don't need more words than that. "I'm sorry, Tom," he said finally. "For every day, I let the silence stand instead of the truth." His hand went slack. This time there was no ambiguity about what that meant. 3 weeks later, Dakota Shaw sat across a kitchen table from her mother, for the first time since the mission, a pot of coffee cooling between them, while sunlight came in, slanted through curtains that hadn't changed in a decade. Her mother had aged in the years since Dakota last visited, properly silver threading further through hair that used to be the same shade as Dakota's own hands, a little more careful around the coffee mug than they used to be. But her eyes were sharp as ever. Sharp in the way of a woman who had spent 12 years quietly grieving a husband while raising a daughter who insisted on chasing his exact same danger. "I read the file," her mother said, finally nodding toward the case Dakota had set on the table between them. "All of it. Twice. Mom, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you sooner. I didn't know for certain until—" "I always knew," her mother interrupted quietly. "Some silences are graves, I told you once. Do you remember that?" "I remember." "I lied to you when I said that. I didn't believe it, not really. I just didn't have the courage to keep digging myself. And I didn't want you to inherit a fight that had already cost our family everything it was going to cost." Her mother's hand found Dakota's across the table steady, despite the tremor that had crept into it over the years. "I'm glad you didn't listen to me. I'm glad you had more courage than I did. You raised me to have it. Your father raised you to have it." Her mother said something soft and sad moving across her face. "I just tried to keep you alive long enough to use it." They sat with that for a long moment, the silence of two women who had spent 12 years carrying the same grief differently, finally allowing it to sit between them, honestly, instead of politely. "Can I ask you something?" Dakota said. "Whitmore. Did you know him? Really know him?" Her mother's face changed, something careful entering it. "He came to dinner a few times back when your father still trusted him." Big laugh. "Brought expensive wine he clearly couldn't afford on a colonel's salary, which should have told us something even then. Your father stopped inviting him after that last Christmas, and when I asked why, all he'd say was, That some men change once they get close enough to real power to taste it. Ashford said he tried to warn Voss's people at the end. Then I suppose even the worst men get one chance to be something other than what they became. Her mother said, quiet considering. I don't know if that's forgiveness. I don't know if it's supposed to be. But I imagine your father would have wanted somebody to remember that he tried, even if it came 30 seconds too late to matter. He'd be proud of you, her mother said finally. Insufferably so, I imagine. He always did like being right more than was strictly healthy for a marriage. Dakota laughed, despite everything a real laugh. The first one that had felt entirely unguarded since before the phone rang 3 times that morning at the lake. I miss him, she said. I know, baby. I do too. Every single day still. That afternoon, Dakota Shaw stood at her father's grave for the first time in 5 years. Sunlight breaking thin and gold through clouds that finally seemed willing to move on. The case containing his final testimony resting on the headstone beside a fresh bouquet. Voss stood beside her, weak but upright weight, braced carefully against a cane he'd need for months. Yet the gray pallor of a man who had come closer to dying than he planned to mention out loud to anyone who wasn't already there. The inquiry's reopening, he said. Full congressional review. Your father's name gets cleared, officially permanently on paper this time, instead of just in the hearts of the people who already knew the truth. It took 12 years. It took exactly as long as it needed to take for someone stubborn enough to keep digging, Voss said. He'd be proud of you, Dakota. Insufferably, insubordinately proud. They found Ashford's second file, Dakota said, at the forward post. Everything he'd been sitting on for 12 years, just waiting for someone to ask the right question. I heard. Voss's jaw tightened. Whole programs being dismantled. 3 more names came out of that file, Dakota. People who signed off on decisions they had no business signing off on. This isn't over. It's just finally started. What happens to your career, sir, after all this? Honestly, Voss shifted his weight against the cane, looking out over the rows of white headstones stretching toward the tree line. I don't much care anymore. I spent 12 years protecting my career by staying quiet about something that should have made noise the day it happened. If speaking up now costs me the rest of it, that's a fair trade for finally sleeping through the night. Danny approached from the parking area, arms still in a sling, but walking under his own power, a small bouquet of his own, clutched awkwardly in his free hand. Ma'am, Colonel. He stopped a respectful distance from the headstone, uncertain suddenly, like a young man who had rehearsed something on the drive over and lost his nerve somewhere in the walking. You made it, Dakota said. Wanted to pay respects. To the man whose daughter came and got us when nobody else would. He set the flowers down carefully, awkwardly beside the others. My mom knows now what actually happened out there. She cried for about an hour. Then she made me promise to write your name down so she could send you a thank you card, which, ma'am, I know is a strange thing for a grown man to admit his mother's doing. But she's not the kind of woman who takes no for an answer. She also wanted me to ask if you'd consider speaking at the base one day. To the new recruits. Said something about wanting them to hear it from somebody who actually lived it, instead of somebody reading it off a slide. Tell her I said thank you back. Dakota said something warm, moving through the grief for just a moment. For raising a soldier who still remembers how to say please and thank you in the middle of a war zone. And tell her yes. I'd be honored to speak to the new recruits whenever she and the base want to arrange it. Danny's face broke into something like relief, the relief of a young man who had rehearsed a request the whole drive over and hadn't been sure it would land. She'll be thrilled, ma'am. Genuinely. I don't think she's stopped talking about you since I told her what happened. Casey and Eli stood a respectful distance back, giving the moment the space it deserved. Though Dakota caught Casey's eye once and found something there that hadn't existed in the hangar that first morning. Not argument, not doubt. Something closer to the loyalty that only gets built by surviving something impossible together. For the record, Casey said quietly when Dakota finally rejoined them. "I still think everything about that mission was insane." "Noted." "I'd do it again tomorrow," Casey added. "Doctrine be damned." "You've changed your tune, Marlowe." "I haven't changed anything," Casey said. "I still believe in doing things by the book. I've just learned the book doesn't cover every situation, and sometimes the person who knows that is worth trusting more than the manual." Eli, standing beside her, allowed himself the smallest satisfied smile. "Told you she'd come around. Took a war zone and a dead general to do it, but I called it back in the hangar." "I came around because I watched you both nearly die twice in one day, for something that actually mattered," Casey said. "Not because anybody told me to. There's a difference, and I'd appreciate you both remembering it." Dakota allowed herself something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived close enough to count. She looked back at the headstone one final time, at her father's name finally sitting beside a truth 12 years overdue, and felt something in her chest settle that had been unsettled since she was 15 years old, standing at this exact spot with a flag too heavy for her hands. Because some silences, she thought, aren't graves after all. Some of them are just waiting for someone brave enough to dig. 6 weeks after that, Dakota Shaw stood on a different tarmac in a different flight suit, her wings officially reinstated by an Air Force that had spent 6 weeks quietly rewriting 18 months of paperwork it no longer wanted associated with its own name. Casey stood beside her, newly assigned as her permanent wingman. The argument in the hangar that first morning now worn smooth into something closer to a running joke between them than an actual disagreement. Eli had transferred in as well, officially attached to their squadron as ground liaison. Though everyone involved understood, the paperwork was a formality dressed up around the simple fact that the three of them had survived something together that made separating them afterward feel almost cruel. "You know," Casey said, watching a new class of pilots file past toward their own first briefing, young and nervous and entirely unaware of how much the day ahead of them could cost. "Somebody's going to have to teach them the stuff that isn't in the manual." "That's usually how it works," Dakota said. "You planning to be that somebody?" Dakota watched the new pilots for a long moment, thinking of a girl on a runway tarmac, 15 years old, grinning up at a man in a flight helmet who was grinning right back, thinking of everything that girl hadn't known yet about the cost of the uniform she would eventually choose to wear herself. "Yeah," she said finally. "I think I am." One of the new pilots broke from the group and approached uncertain, the way young officers often are around someone whose story has already outgrown the person living it. 23 years old, nervous hands, a name tape that read, Reyes. "Captain Shaw." The young woman hesitated. "I just wanted to say, what you did out there. It's why I signed up for this instead of something safer." Dakota studied her for a moment, seeing something of herself in the nervous set of the young woman's shoulders. Something of Casey's stubborn readiness to prove herself before anyone had asked her to. "Then let me give you the only advice that actually matters," Dakota said. "The manual will teach you how to fly the aircraft. It won't teach you when to break every rule in it to save the people underneath you. That part you'll have to learn the same way I did." "How's that?" "Badly and all at once on the one day it actually counts." Dakota allowed herself something that wasn't quite a smile. "Try not to let it take 12 years to understand why." Reyes nodded, uncertain but grateful, and returned to the formation, and Dakota watched her go with something warm settling behind her ribs that hadn't been there in longer than she could remember. Because some lessons only get taught by people who survived learning them the hard way. And somewhere she suspected her father was finally allowed to rest easy, knowing exactly who was standing at the front of that briefing room, ready to make sure nobody else's daughter had to wait 12 years for the truth. The engines of the flight line rumbled to life behind her, steady and familiar. The sound of a promise her father had made to her a long time ago finally fully kept.